Everybody, I'm Howard Gleckman, Senior Fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center and editor of TPC's tax blog, TaxVox. Welcome to our newest webcast, The Prescription, Fiscal Policy for the COVID-19 Economy. Every other Thursday afternoon, we'll be having a conversation with a state, local, or federal government official or a leading economist or other expert on the COVID-19 economy and ideas for fixing it. Our guest today is Jason Furman, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and currently a professor of economics at Harvard's Kennedy School. Before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be posted online on TPC's website. All participants are muted, but many of you sent in questions when you registered, and I'll try to ask a few of them today. And if you want to talk about us on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So Jason, welcome. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with TPC.
Thank you. So a former chair of the CEA, Austin Goolsbee, says that the virus economics is different from regular economics. And that implies that if the disease is different, so must the cure be different. Is he right?
Austin is right that the single highest value thing we can do is control the spread of the virus. So, what we're doing with social distancing, testing and tracing, and developing treatments and ultimately developing a vaccine. Absolutely, that is a higher return than anything else. But a lot of the normal laws of economics work right now. If somebody has more money, they'll spend more money. If somebody doesn't have money, they'll be in deprivation, hungry and the like. If states get more money, they'll have better education programs in September. If they don't get money, they'll lay off teachers and contract the economy. So I think a lot of the normal fiscal stimulus really does work right now.
Right now, is it time for stimulus? Because one of the arguments was, well, really what we need to do is provide people relief and not really worry so much about inducing demand like you normally would do in a recession.
Yeah, that's a common view, Howard. I think that view is wrong. What you want to do is provide relief. Who do you want to provide relief to? Somebody who, if they didn't get the money, wouldn't have been able to afford their rent, wouldn't have been able to afford their food, and with the money, they can make those payments. Well, that means you actually have a high multiplier. It means if the person is smoothing their consumption, they're spending more than they would have absent the assistance. So I think a lot of the assistance we've done has been relatively high multiplier in a traditional Keynesian sense spending. Even if all you're doing is targeting to the people at greatest need, they're the people who will spend it. So I don't actually buy the rigid distinction between expanding demand and helping people in need. I think they're very much the same.
So it's interesting, recent BEA data suggests that many households are not spending. Savings rate has gone way up, surprised some people. So what does that tell you about whether the first round is working and whether we ought to be doing a second round?
Yeah. So the first round of fiscal measures is extraordinary. It's more than 20% of GDP in just the second quarter of this year. It's done something which is make it so that disposable personal income actually rose in April and is likely to rise for the quarter as a whole, even amidst a collapsing economy. Now, there's too many people that were left out of that and who weren't eligible for programs, maybe because of immigration status or others. So I think it's a shame that it didn't include things like SNAP benefits for nutrition. I hope that gets fixed going forward. But broadly speaking, we did a good job of protecting people's incomes. When it comes to consumption, there were two constraints on consumption in April. One was that no one wanted to go to a restaurant, no one wanted to travel, no one wanted to go to a live event, and in fact, couldn't do almost any of those things. That's something you need to solve with health policy. But there was a second potential constraint, which is if you had a lot less money or a fear that you were going to have a lot less money in the future. That second one, fiscal policy addressed. It didn't do it perfectly or fully, but it did it quite well. And if you look at things like the daily data on consumption spending, when stimulus checks went out, you saw consumption spending go up. I've heard from big box retailers that a lot more people were shopping on days that they got their stimulus payments. So I think the marginal spending out of that is something research will have to determine. It might be high even if overall average spending was low in April.
Interesting. So you've got an interesting formulation. I've seen you describe the COVID-19 economy in these three phases: collapse, partial bounce back, and what you call the slog. Where are we along this continuum? Of course, the weekly unemployment claims that came out today showed only 1.9 million people filed. Does that suggest to you that we've hit the bottom of the collapse and are beginning the bounce back phase?
Yeah, I think, collapse happened by April 1st, just an economy going straight down to about 85% of where it normally would be. Partial bounce back is a rapid form of growth where people return to their previous jobs, businesses reopen, but it's only partial because then a lot of people are never going back to their original employers. They need to find new jobs, new sectors. That takes a long time. It's a slog. There's a rich set of daily data available now on spending, employment, mobility, and the like. It seems to indicate that for things like spending, there was that partial bounce back started around April 15th, that consumer spending is up about 30% from April 15th through the end of May. So a very rapid increase in consumer spending, still in a deep hole, but a partial bounce back. With employment, what's striking is how big the gross flows are. Lots of people still losing jobs, lots of people coming back to their jobs. The net for May, we're going to find out tomorrow, but almost certainly will be negative. I think the jobs number for June will probably be show millions of jobs were added. That would leave us in a big hole, but would clearly be the beginning of a partial bounce back in the labor market.
So give me a sense of a time frame here. CBO the other day just suggested it's going to take a decade for the U.S. to fully recover from this. The president, of course, suggests that we'll be back to normal in months. What's your sense of how long this is going to take?
Yeah, there's obviously a tremendous amount of uncertainty. It depends on the virus, depends on policy, it depends on all sorts of other factors. If I had to pick, I would say that sometime in 2023, our per capita GDP would be what it was at the end of 2019. So 4 years where it goes down, goes back up again, and it's basically flat. In terms of being on our previous trend, for an event like this, I don't think you get back to your previous trend. Even if we get back to the previous growth rate, we will have missed a year of investment, we'll have missed a year of R&D, and that leaves you permanently a little bit poorer. So I, broadly speaking, would find myself a little bit darker than where CBO is. And that's largely because I think there's a large supply shock, a large reallocation shock, and that's something that takes a long time to work through the system, even with good policies. And I don't know that we're going to have the perfect policies.
I guess we never have the perfect policies. Will we have good enough policies? I guess that's a real question.
They've been pretty good so far. I mean, the Fed has done exactly the right thing, not with the small business lending program that it has, the Main Street lending program it has, but that was on the instructions of the Treasury. The fiscal policy response, I would have liked to have seen state and local governments. I would have liked to have seen nutritional assistance. I would have liked to have seen automatic stabilizers, but it was very large. It was very fast, larger than anything in any other country that I'm aware of, and more progressive than anything in any other country that I'm aware of. So there's something to be said for it at a time when, we love to be cynical and think nothing's happening.
So you mentioned a few things that you wish they had done that they didn't. What do you think the most effective policy action has been so far?
Probably the unemployment insurance, because that's getting money at a large scale in a targeted way. Definitely imperfect, big delays in lots of states because of problems, in some cases deliberate with their administrative systems. I think $600 a week is too large a number to continue after July when we're in a different phase of the economy. But that's probably been the most important for protecting families, maintaining demand, and putting households in a position where they can either spend now or have pent up demand and spend later.
So just to be clear, you would extend federal unemployment, but not at $600. At what level? 400? What's a?
I would rather try to get as many states as possible to switch over to a replacement rate. So have something like the federal government do 40% of your previous wages, which together with what the states do would get you to about 90% of your previous wages. You could cap that at something like $400 a week. So, up to the median worker, it would replace 90%. The replacement rate would fall above that. That's sort of just throwing some numbers out there. I certainly think it should be dependent on the unemployment rate and linked automatically. So as the unemployment rate comes down, the replacement rate comes down.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little bit about what they should have done and didn't. We've talked about what they've done that you like. Were there some provisions that at least in this early stage you look at and say this was just a waste?
I think the Paycheck Protection Plan, PPP, was well-intentioned. I think it has not worked. I didn't expect it to work. And so that was, $600 billion, depending on how much it ultimately costs, dollars, that I don't think will have a persistent positive effect. The problem with PPP is that a lot of the money went to more successful businesses and was a windfall for their owners. And except in the unlikely case where it was the difference between bankruptcy and not bankruptcy, it's unlikely that any business that got PPP would employ a different number of people after the program expires later this year. They could have furloughed the workers and rehired them. They could have had them the whole time. But in December, when you're deciding how many workers to have, it's going to be based on what your sales are in the month of December, not whether you got PPP 6 months earlier. So I don't think it has much of a persistent impact. I think a lot of the incidence is on higher income households.
So there's some tax provisions, and I want to get your perspective on those. $300 above the line charitable giving deduction, the NOL carryback provision that allows businesses to look back and take losses from this year and last year and the year before, going back 5 years. What do you think of those changes?
The above line for charity, I don't think you get any extra charitable giving because of something like that. And so it's just, another barnacle on the tax code as it moves through the system. It's not an overly offensive one, but, I don't get too excited about one way or the other. The NOLs, I confess I'm torn. Economically, it's a perfectly good thing to do. But Congress, when they did tax reform, they actually limited NOLs, limited the carry forward to 80%, got rid of I think they got rid of the carrybacks. That made no sense whatsoever as part of tax reform. So I would have rather have seen, the corporate rate be 1 percentage point higher and not have had that NOL provision. That would have been stronger for economic growth than what Congress did. So this brings you to something that is economically sensible, but it costs a lot of money. And I don't think it's worth the money that is being spent on it. I think it's especially not if it gets continued and becomes permanent. So I would have said, raise the corporate rate and do the NOL provision, and that would be a good way to reform the corporate tax code.
So let's look forward a little bit now. We talked a lot about what Congress has done and what they might have done. Let's talk about what you think ought to be in this next bill. You've mentioned UI. What else do you think ought to be in kind of the next round of stimulus?
Yeah, number one priority is state and local fiscal relief. Their budget year starts July 1st. That's among the best documented ways to stimulate an economy, a multiplier of 1.7 or higher, according to a literature survey, recent one published by Gabrielle Chodorow-Reich. And that's, above and beyond all of the benefits it has for education and the like. So state fiscal relief, number one. Number two is continuing expanded unemployment insurance, starting to taper it down, but making sure it continues. Number three is all the people that have been left out and left behind, especially expanding nutritional assistance, or even just using EBT cards and putting cash on them. Fourth, making everything I just said as automatic going forward as possible. We ended stimulus too soon in the wake of the Great Recession. I don't want us to see us make that mistake again. So if the unemployment rate is high, it automatically continues. Those are the immediate priorities. Then I think we're going to need to do a lot in terms of infrastructure, community college, training, and the like. If that second set of stuff waits a little bit longer, I think that's okay. The states, localities unemployed can't wait.
So there's also a set of issues that Democrats seem to want to add to the next round, expanding the earned income credit, the child credit. Do you see those as stimulus? Do you see those as good to do but not necessary to do now? What's your take on those changes?
I love the EITC. I love the expanded child credit. I think they would be perfectly fine to include in the legislation. They'd be perfectly fine to be permanent provisions. If I had to prioritize, SNAP benefits, somebody can get the money in, I don't know, weeks. And the EITC, you're not necessarily going to get that money for a year. And so in terms of, an immediate top priority, I would go with what's going to get people money right away. But, I'm in favor of all of that.
So given the news recently, we got a question, which is, what is fiscal policy for COVID-19 economy that addresses and reduces racial inequality look like? Are there special changes that you can think of that would affect that set of issues?
Yeah, I think everything I've been talking about would reduce racial inequality. The unemployment rate is disproportionately high for African Americans and for Hispanics, so the unemployment insurance is very important. State and local governments both disproportionately employ underrepresented minorities and are playing a really important role for them. So that assistance is really important. Making sure that we're expanding SNAP benefits and the like. And by the way, some of the limitations in terms of immigration status that matter a lot for Hispanics. So the program that I was outlining is one that is very progressive along income lines and would disproportionately matter in terms of racial justice. It is only a tiny bit of what needs to be done as part of the much, much larger and longer term problem of both racial injustice and inequality. So I would not pretend that it is solving any sort of bigger problems that we have in our country. But what it is designed is to deal with this massive, massive immediate problem that we have.
So I think one of the most interesting debates that's shaping up in the next bill is how best to encourage people to return to work. President Trump has proposed a payroll tax holiday, but several members of the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, ranging from Pramila Jayapal, who's one of the most liberal members of the House, to Josh Hawley, who's a conservative senator, favors some form of wage credit that would be paid to employers. Do you think policies on those lines would actually help people get back to work?
I think the biggest constraint on getting people back to work is demand. There's just so many jobs that don't exist right now. It's not like Macy's is going to be unable to reopen its department stores because it can't find workers. It has workers that furloughed. It can bring those workers back. And by the way, a lot of them won't be able to get unemployment insurance once Macy's tells them it wants them to come back. So I think the problem is that they can't open their stores and get customers into their stores, not that they can't find workers. So primarily we have a demand problem. And so anything that strengthens aggregate demand will help. Anything that helps control the virus will help. Unemployment insurance at $600 a week does set up some supply incentives. I don't think those have been particularly important to date, but at some point those would become more problematic. And one idea that's out there is giving people a signing bonus when they take a new job, and that would sort of cancel that out and give you a bit of an extra supply incentive. In terms of all the different ideas for so-called European style models, I distinguish between paying a business for an employee who's working. We did that in PPP, and that is what happens with small businesses under the employer retention tax credit. I think that's largely a windfall to their owners and is not a well-targeted way of spending money. There's then, if somebody can't work, if a business still has to furlough their employees, reimbursing the employer for their wages so they formally stay employed. I think that's relatively similar to furloughing them and putting them on unemployment insurance, but has some pros and cons, but not profoundly different from unemployment insurance. So I guess the bottom line of all of that, just to simplify it, is broadly speaking, what we should do is make sure we're continuing to support people who are unable to work because the economy does not have enough jobs. We can do that through unemployment insurance. You could do that through a very expanded employee retention tax credit.
So to your mind, this is a matter of kind of visuals, sort of what it looks like, but essentially economically, it's no different than unemployment.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you tell an employer you have an employee, and if they can't work, you should still pay them and we'll pay you back. Or if they can't work, you should furlough them. The government will give them a check. Either way, if you have something useful for that employee to do, let's say they're paid $50,000 a year, if they can produce more than $50,000 worth of stuff, you're going to want to pay them yourself without the government paying them and have them produce that stuff and make a profit. If they can't produce $50,000 worth of stuff, then you're going to want the government to pay them either directly through UI or indirectly through retention and have them not show up at work. Those are economically reasonably similar. I know some people are hung up on the optics of labor force attachment and the like. I don't think a lot of these businesses that are furloughing people are completely detaching them. I think the people that will be detached are where there's no demand for their labor and they end up rehiring fewer people, not that they want to rehire the same number and just can't find them.
So that raises, I think, another set of really interesting questions. We've been using cheap money, easy access to capital, government loans, all sorts of things to keep businesses afloat. And I think the question is how long do we continue to do that? When do we know it's time to use a bad metaphor, to take them off of federal life support to see if they can breathe on their own?
We should spend money without any artificial size. So I wouldn't say, hey, I just ran some numbers and the economy needs $1 trillion, $3 trillion, $8 trillion. I don't think it has a specific dollar need. I also wouldn't say I ran some numbers and you can't spend more than 1 trillion, 3 trillion, 5 trillion. I do more of a bottom-up approach, which is, your unemployment insurance and compensating and protecting people who are unemployed. How much will that cost? States and localities, what's their budget hole? How much will it cost to fill their budget hole? I think any place where you're filling a hole in demand is a place where you likely have a multiplier above 1, and you likely have a situation where the debt is going to go up as a result of your actions by less than GDP goes up as a result of your actions. And so the debt to GDP ratio actually falls. So I think anything where the multiplier is probably greater than 1 is almost certainly worth doing. Then if something is serving an important priority, it's getting to someone who's really badly in need and supporting education and the like, I would do that too. If it's a longer term plan like infrastructure, I personally would prefer to see that paid for. I don't think it's a disaster if it's not paid for, but I'd rather see it paid for. And then in terms of where all this leaves us for the debt, right now, real interest rates are negative. So when we borrow money, we're repaying with money that's worth even less than what we borrowed. The expectations in financial markets are that interest rates will stay very low. If you want to buy insurance, rather than worrying about debt reduction, shift to more long-term borrowing where you can lock in those longer-term interest rates is the cheaper, easier way to buy yourself insurance against fiscal risk. And then in a couple of years, we can sort out where we are, what level of debt to GDP we want to stabilize at, and how we want that stabilization to happen.
Okay, so we only have a few minutes, and I'd like to actually explore that last question. So assuming that at some point we decide that the debt to GDP ratio it just really is too high to sustain, um, and we decide we want to raise taxes, what taxes do we raise and on whom?
I would start with higher taxes at the top. There's a couple percentage points of GDP of room there. The very first ones I do is where you could do it efficiently. So I'd raise the corporate rate, combine that with expensing, disallowing interest deductions, and expand the R&D credit. I think that would increase economic growth and raise substantial revenues. I'd raise the tax rate at the top, but also limit tax benefits for things like home ownership and the like. Definitely would not restore the state and local deduction. I think that would be a complete waste of money to do. The taxation of capital income, getting rid of step-up basis, raising the estate tax, raising capital gains, et cetera. So that would be my agenda at the top. That would be a bare minimum. Ultimately, to have the type of society that a lot of progressives want with more expanded paid leave, more expanded unemployment insurance, higher levels of investment in infrastructure, more healthcare and the like, I think you're going to need to do more than just tax on the top 2%. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, none of them overly pleasant. And finally, I should say I'm not mentioning a carbon tax because my expectation is when we do that, the revenue will be recycled. So it won't actually be available for new programs or deficit reduction, but will be a climate policy.
So I know you struggled a little bit with this issue of a wealth tax. What do you think now about a wealth tax?
I think it's, an interesting academic issue to debate. I don't think it's a very practical one, given the potential constitutional impediments. I think there's a lot of policy downsides to it as well. If we're going to do some radical idea on taxing capital, I'd much rather that we develop and explore mark-to-market taxation, where you pay the taxes on your gains every year as you realize, as they accrue, rather than when you realize them. That in some ways actually more progressive than a wealth tax and does a better job of taxing the monopoly returns that people get, not just the sort of core year in and year out normal rate of return.
So last question, do we pay for this, or do we simply accept the high debt to GDP ratio as the price of what we had to do to get the economy, keep the economy going? I was going to, and just live with it.
The economics is very clear that temporary emergency measures do not need to be paid for. Financial markets seem to agree with economists. Even Germany isn't paying for its temporary emergency programs right now. So I think there's very little debate about that. Where we want to go after this, my own exit strategy is one that I think is somewhat shocking when a lot of people hear it right now, but I think will become common sense 5 years from now. I think to try to stabilize the debt to GDP at about 150%. To do that in a world where interest rates are about 1.5 percentage points below the growth rate would allow you to run a primary deficit, a deficit excluding interest, of about 2.25% of GDP. We're currently above that, but the adjustment to get there would look a lot like some combination of what we did in 1990 and 1993. And something like that is in our future 5 to 10 years from now, not in any huge hurry to get there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Jason Furman, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you, and good luck making it through the rest of the COVID-19 economy.
You too. A wonderful discussion.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be back doing this again in a couple of weeks. So we hope you can join us for that. Thanks very much.